everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I am very, very excited to welcome Kurt Kipka, who is the Chief Impact Officer at the Apparel Impact Institute. As Chief Impact Officer, Kurt manages the growth and longevity of global programs, including Clean by Design, a proven platform for improving the resource efficiency of textile mills in collaboration with multinational brands. Prior to that, he spent time at the Natural Resources Defense Council and Target Corporation. Kurt, so excited to have you.
Really, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kaitlyn.
And I know you've had such an interesting career journey. I was hoping we could start out a little bit with that, moving from retail to nonprofit and now at the Apparel Impact Institute. So please, let's hear about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I realize that there's, in a lot of cases, not a real clear career path when it comes to the role that I have or roles like mine. And so I always find it fascinating to hear how people got to where they are as well. I started my career, as you mentioned, at Target Corporation, where I followed what is a fairly traditional career path of being a sourcing manager eventually. So started as a business analyst. I actually went back to business school throughout that time and really started to get interested in sustainability through the lens of long-term planning and longevity of business success. That led me to start asking some questions in the sourcing decisions that I was making while I was there. And lo and behold, it got me kind of known as this green guy who was asking about waste, efficiency, where materials were coming from, what source of materials we were using. And that provided me an opportunity then to begin a sourcing sustainability team at Target, overseeing the development of a strategy for the organization, asking similar questions organization-wide for the products that Target was sourcing globally at that time. As a person with a business background, I realized very quickly that I needed to bring some experts in to hold up the strategy that I was setting. And that's where I became in contact with great folks like those at the Natural Resources Defense Council. One in particular, Dr. Linda Greer, who's become a mentor of mine, really kind of took me under her wing to kind of provide the technical, environmental, and academic side of the work that I was leading and strategizing at that time. And I guess the eventual landing spot of me at NRDC kind of foreshadows from that point forward how much Linda and I hit it off. I then joined the Natural Resources Defense Council from Target to head up a program which was mentioned in my intro, the Clean by Design program, to grow it in a way that would eventually find a landing spot for it. And that landing spot is Apparel Impact Institute. So about 5 years ago, I was working with Natural Resources Defense Council and a number of our partners to transition myself, a number of my staff at the time, and some of the IP and technical aspects of a highly successful program to Apparel Impact Institute before launching what has now been a 5-year growth trajectory for this organization, applying some of those similar principles along the way.
I love that you started in procurement, if I can call it that, procurement. Or some people, I know different companies have different terms for that department sometimes. A lot of people come to me saying, I'm a numbers cruncher and I'm at the bottom of the barrel of the procurement department. And I feel like I really want to do your job, right? Like I want to have a climate job. And I said, if you're in procurement, you are in a climate job. You are in a human rights job.
100%.
You have a huge potential influence there. So I love, this is an actual case study. Your career is a case study in how starting where you are and having an impact where you are is the absolute best thing you can do. I think that's my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. And in fact, for individuals who I've mentored over the years, that's something that I continue to drive home is this concept of being your own champion within the role you have for the role that you want in the future. And this concept is, again, coming back to what kind of brought me to this work. I think that the environmental, the ESG side of the work that we do is kind of what inspires people to this work, but there's also business-oriented longevity and sustainability in the sense of long-term longevity that's involved in the work that we do, which makes a clear case for business decisions regardless of where you are within the organization. And so there doesn't need to be a distinction between being passionate and driving ESG related work and the objectives you may have as an individual within your role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Well said. Well, let's talk a little bit about Clean by Design. So this is your baby. Tell us a little bit about what the program actually is and the impact that it has.
Yeah, so first of all, I have to give credit where credit is due. Dr. Linda Greer, who I mentioned previously, my mentor and really a leader in this sector, is the founder of the program. She graciously brought me in to kind of carry the torch forward on her behalf. And so I suppose after about 10 years of leading the initiative, I can call it my baby at this point in time too. But with that, really what Clean by Design does is finds low-hanging fruit, business-friendly opportunities for supply chain actors to succeed on a path of driving environmental improvements at production sites. The process started more than 10 years ago now with a study that Dr. Greer led while she was at Natural Resources Defense Council, ultimately looking at industry as a whole, not just the apparel or fashion sector, but industry overall, and looking for the right place for an initiative that she would lead, ultimately landing on the fashion sector, not necessarily because it's the most impact driven or impact oriented sector. It definitely is a high impact or high environmental impact area, but there's really low-hanging fruit opportunities and opportunities for fairly rapid improvement within the sector based on basically the shift that happened in the 1990s to outsource or globally expand this industry more broadly. Many of the practices that were expanded at that time haven't been revisited for more than 20 and now 30 years since then. And so when we talk about low-hanging fruit, we're talking about initiatives that a production facility can put into place with little or no investment in their in equipment or the work that they're doing, and get very fast returns on investment or payback periods. So it's a list. We started with a list of 10 best practices, which ultimately any facility can bring forward. And we've since expanded that to become more robust and sophisticated. However, the idea at the time of the creation of this program was to really build a psychological mindset towards seeking and finding and building internal expertise around investment in new solutions. And so those 10 best practices end up amounting in many cases and is somewhere around the $200,000 to $400,000 range of investment that a facility might take on, but they pay back for themselves in less than 12 months' time. So really no-brainer solutions for the facility to bring forward. And what that does is then whets the appetite for more. And that really represents a theory of change, which we've incorporated into our programs at AII, starting with a foundation of initial performance, a set of interventions or best practices, and then a final result. Now, as we're in this age surrounding climate in particular, of looking at things through a science-based lens, I like to think that Linda was kind of approaching this in a science-based approach before it became kind of cool and before it became kind of mainstream. And so, as you can imagine, grounded in a more academic research and nonprofit oriented view of how this work can be done, it really creates a strong demand for the quality programming that AII and our partners bring forward currently.
That's awesome. And so tell us a little bit about how the Apparel Impact Institute came about and took on this program.
Yeah, so dating back to even my profile, a big part of what I was tasked to do at the Natural Resources Defense Council was to find a long-term home for this program or for the work that Clean by Design represented for the industry, recognizing that the really business-friendly approach belonged within the industry as something with a commercial viable model to be deployed. And so I actively sought out where the organization or where the program could land long term. I began conversations with I'll try not to use acronyms, but we're an industry of acronyms with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, a Dutch organization, amongst a number of brands and retailers at the time to determine where the appropriate landing spot for this work might be. And ultimately, it resulted in the creation of the Apparel Impact Institute, an organization that would kind of foster new ideas, programs like ours that simply needed a roof over our heads or a particular barrier that needed to be addressed that an overarching umbrella organization could provide. And that's really what started the transition of Clean by Design to Apparel Impact Institute. Our president at the time, Louis Perkins, and I actually really hit it off as well. And so we probably could have maintained this course of AII as an umbrella, Clean by Design as a separate institute or a separate department under the organization. But we realized very quickly that the foundational elements of our programming really carry forward in the way that AII could also evaluate new partners that might come under this umbrella, which has significantly now shifted the role that I have within the organization, not just overseeing Clean by Design and the expansion of that work globally, but also to actively seek out external partners who have similar quality programs or similar quality programs that with a little of support, structure, or resources would help to advance the environmental impact reductions of this industry in a coordinated and consistent way, still basing it on that foundation of science-based approaches that Clean by Design represented for the industry and has represented for the industry for more than 10 years.
So is the main mission focused on the reduction of emissions specifically of greenhouse gas emissions? Is there also a labor component, or is this really focused on climate?
We really zero in on environment, maybe more generally as a term. And when I say environment, Clean by Design in particular focuses on water, energy, or carbon, if you will, and then also wastewater treatment and chemicals management components. With the high demand and interest in climate of the last couple of years, it's really led us to focus our efforts with a climate first approach, perhaps is the best way to put it. But meanwhile, there's a recognition, particularly with the types of facilities we work with, that all of these topics are integrated, that you can't have an energy conversation without a water conversation. And that's something that our team continues to track, even if a lot of our recent initiatives and projects are centered on climate or carbon reduction. We're ultimately looking at the overall effect of any intervention that we're putting in place at a production facility.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And it's cool that you guys are bringing this together for the whole industry in a way, because that's one of the things that we hear a lot from clients, whether it's not fashion industry, right? This is all industries, right? Every sector, they're like, well, no one wants to be the first to stick their neck out, and no one wants to be, well, we want to see what that company does. Well, that company is like, well, we don't know what to do.
Yes. Yeah.
That's how progress can get stalled. So it seems like a really interesting case study for really for an industry, how an industry can come together and bring all these best practices together. So how do you work with the companies?
Well, for one thing, I think you just teed up what we do well as an organization is the fact that we are willing to stick our neck out on behalf of partners that we work with, but utilize, I would say, a fairly risk-averse approach to doing so. So we have, within our organization, worked with now more than 40, I think we're over 50 total global brands that make up the partners that we work with. And often a new idea or concept is something that is derived from the conversations that our team is having with those brands, or perhaps even the manufacturers that we're working with as well. And we kind of crowdsource new concepts or white space opportunities based on that interaction. And so something that we do and will continue to do for the industry is play this role of aggregator, both in terms of data that is derived from the projects that we deploy, but also concepts that can help to kind of be the tip of the spear for the industry. So it's quite often that as an organization that isn't a membership-based organization, we can move fairly quickly and nimbly through the type of development work that we do. So if 3 brands and their 3 manufacturers come to us with a pilot that they want to deploy, we can either identify funding partners to bring project funding to that work, or aggregate funding across those actors and get it started right off the bat, really representing a rapid prototyping process that can then be deployed across the industry, or in the case of individual brands or manufacturers, can be taken back and expanded within their organization. And so it's really our aim to assess any individual project or initiative that we take on as a team in terms of the potential impact that it can have for the sector overall. And then we track that impact, the data that's derived from those projects, both in the confines of a pilot, a test, or an implementation, but then also over time with our partners to demonstrate the replication and the growth of, carbon, water reductions within the production sites that we work with.
Very cool. Do you have a specific example you could share about, say, a project and its impact, and something that would help make it more concrete?
Absolutely. So I'll try not to get too into the weeds on the apparel and textile supply chain, but I can drift very quickly.
That's okay. We like the weeds on ESG Decoded. We are in the weeds.
So that's fantastic.
So go as deep as you'd like.
So the apparel supply chain, in terms of a product getting from origin to the point of being a final product, there's a number of different ways to look at it. We kind of prescribe to a 4-tier system. Tier 1 being finished goods. A t-shirt is the end result of that product. Tier 2 being the dyeing or finishing of that product. The key indicator there is where there's a large amount of water that's being used within the production process. And then tier 3 being what is derived at tier 4. So think in the simplest form, cotton, and turning it into processing it in order to be dyed or finished in tier 2. So it's a 4-tier process that we try to break the supply chain into. And trust me, a lot of different organizations look at that in different ways as well. But just for the sake of this conversation, let's consider it that way. Because what I mentioned at tier 2, where there's water being used, there's also a lot of heat that's used in that production process. Because there's heat being used, that ends up being, from a climate or a carbon standpoint, really the hotspot of that full chain of 4 tiers for where the most impact can be derived. In many cases, because of the thermal energy that's needed in order to dye and finish fabrics. So with that, as many organizations in this industry have set science-based targets and then subsequently scope 3 targets, which is almost always the case for a fashion or apparel brand needs to set a scope 3 target. Again, stop me if I'm getting a little bit too off track here. So with that, with the setting of a scope 3 target, very quickly, it's natural to go to where are the hot spots for where I can make the most progress on my scope 3 target that I've set. And almost always you land in tier 2. And when you're in tier 2, where wet processing is happening, you almost always land on where thermal energy is being used in the production process. Thermal energy is key because the sources of that thermal energy are typically fossil fuels derived. In coal, in many cases, it is used for the creation of the thermal energy, sometimes natural gas, and in other cases, it's possible to electrify that process, but not always consistent. And so ultimately, as we partnered with a number of organizations and partners that we have, we realized that this is something that really needs to be looked into, is the thermal energy needs of the sector and how the industry as a whole can begin to actively address that process. And so we did a fact-finding mission with a number of the brand partners that we work with to identify first the highest emitting or the highest energy users within a set of 6 major brand and retailer supply chains in tier 2, identified where a boiler is used to create that thermal energy, fuel source of those boilers, and then ultimately began to plot a plan, a set of if-then scenarios. If you have this type of boiler, what are the possible scenarios for dramatically reducing the environmental impacts or the carbon that's being utilized for the source of that energy? And so our aim through what is a target setting process surrounding coal boilers or gas boilers or boilers generally is then to create long-term roadmaps for either boiler efficiency, boiler retrofit, or even process optimizations that might reduce the demand for thermal energy overall for that production site. And our aim with that process is to significantly reduce, if not completely reduce, that hotspot within the sector, representing 50%, actually technically 52% of the apparel supply chain's overall emissions. So tier 2 representing 52%, the vast majority of that coming from that thermal energy use. By pulling that lever would almost achieve a full scope 3 emissions target for many of our partners. And I'm not saying that's possible because even where electrification is possible, you're assuming that the grid is also one that makes it feasible in order to make that transition. But then we can at least begin to look at renewable energy options as a source of on-site capabilities. But it really represents where we just started to follow, a term we use or a phrase we use quite often, we just started to follow the pounds. Where are the pounds of carbon and how do we actively address them?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think a lot of companies have really struggled with scope 3. And there tends to be a lot of, oh, well, we can't even get that data, or, no, it's impossible. But I think this is a really interesting example where it is possible and you've identified a pathway to not only identify where that hotspot is, but actually to provide some options for how to address it. So really cool.
It's really our aim to make that impossible or challenging task at least more palatable. I think where a lot of organizations get hung up is in mapping, just simply knowing where the supply chain is, particularly in this apparel space. It's incredibly opaque and it evolves season to season, year over year. But what we've learned is that what doesn't change in many cases is who those large suppliers are, or perhaps the more strategic suppliers are. And we offer what I feel are very pragmatic approaches for identifying hotspots within hotspots, if you will, looking at what we know about a set of suppliers, and then in a calculating way, beginning to slowly bite off reasonable chunks of work, focusing on highest emitters, most strategic, and really where the work can provide internal learning for the brand partners or retailers or manufacturers we work with that can then be proliferated within the organization to eventually the long tail of the supply chain. But we don't need to address that long tail in some cases, even to hit a target, but ideally we're addressing that long tail over time in terms of elevating the entire industry based on the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I wanted to ask you as well, you guys, I believe recently launched the Fashion Climate Fund. Yeah. Let us know what's that about.
Yeah. So really the origins of the Fashion Climate Fund, you could kind of trace them back to a number of different sources. But one thing that really sticks to me in relation to the programmatic work, which I've done historically, is that as we published reports, both at NRDC and ultimately at AII around the work that we were doing, we started to get banks and investors coming to us with projects that they were considering to fund, both in terms of the financial return that it would provide, but also the environmental return that it could provide. And we were asked to provide due diligence or de-risk this opportunity based on the potential environmental impact. Well, similar to what I described earlier, the way that we kind of form our projects, we realized there's something here. there's a need in not just the brand retailer manufacturer relationship, but also in the banking sector, the investment sector, in order to drive alignment for what is a good project to invest in. And so we started to look at different sources of where these funds typically come from. And ultimately, with reporting that we did along with partners at HSBC, created a size of the prize report. So ultimately, if this industry is going to hit net zero by 2050, how much funding and financing is that ultimately going to take? And then began to utilize our programs as kind of the catalyst for that investment. And we feel that with the launch of the Fashion Climate Fund, we're providing the catalytic investment needed in order to prompt not the $1 trillion opportunity, but $250 million in funding that would be contributed to the catalytic, the beginning of work that's going to drive further financing for the sector. So $250 million in that seed funding in order to prompt programs that are in need of barriers being addressed, resources, or even just proof of concept, would ultimately unlock $2 billion in investment and financing. And so we work both with brand partners, philanthropic partners to be the source of the Fashion Climate Fund. Those organizations make a $10 million commitment to the programming that we'll deploy between now and 2030. And then on the back end of that, our aim is to utilize that initial project seed funding for connection points with investors, with banks who can grow and use those learnings as a way to invest in a climate positive future. And so we work with a number of brands on that Fashion Climate Fund development and deployment process. But at the core of that, we're also using this same really pragmatic, but also science-based approach to identifying which projects will fund. And we're actually on the cusp of announcing our first set of grantees who will receive funding from the Fashion Climate Fund, utilizing a set of criteria which we've created to evaluate them and ultimately begin to expand this path for the industry towards a net zero future.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. And did we, I think we talked about this. Is it focused on really supply chain specifically, not sort of post-consumer?
Yes. So I think using scope 3 is kind of the mantra that helps to position what we're looking at. And those tiers are really where we're looking at too, where the production is made. I like to make that distinction too, because we're not necessarily looking at logistics or shipping. We're looking at production processes, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And with that, following where the impacts can be the most. So we find ourselves leaning towards initiatives that are going to help to drive reductions within tier 2 because of the significant proportion of the carbon or gas bubble, if you will, that the tier 2 contains. But then we also look at this as a portfolio approach, and we want to ensure that we're providing resources, solutions for really any tier of the supply chain that allows us to kind of advance the industry to meet them where they are, not just the brands retailers seeking to achieve a scope 3 target, but also manufacturers or even government actors who are seeking to drive a particular initiative within their region or their production site.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I just also want to point out like how massive the potential impact is and how massive the problem you're trying to address is, because looking at those numbers, 250 million seed funding could unlock $2 billion of investment and finance, each company making 10 million commitment. This is huge. Apparel Impact Institute, huge, huge, huge. And yet this is just production.
Just production.
Right? Like there's so many layers to all of these things. So just that's impactful to me to think about, right? Just to have that focus there and see numbers like that and think about the potential impact for achieving a scope 3 target. Wow. It's just huge.
Even today, as someone who's been in this space for years, more than 10 years, it's still very difficult to grasp just how big this industry is and how big the supply chain is. And it's constantly humbling to be, in the presence of massive production facilities and the logistics that it takes just to move goods around this world to make them available. It's when we go through challenges in the last few years with supply chain disruption, it starts to make sense that one little blip can cause a massive change when you consider the tens of thousands of production sites that it takes to keep just clothing alone within stores and on the shelves.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Yeah. Well, this has been so fabulous. Is there any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Only that, for as daunting and as complicated that this work may be, there's practitioners out there, whether it's in the apparel textile space or, any other industry, who have likely done something similar to what anyone is faced with, those challenges that we face. And I really think that that's something that I really pride myself on within this industry, is connecting people and networking with people in order to address those barriers. And if not, then there's plenty of people like myself who are willing to address those barriers head on and begin to work together, drive the relationships that are needed to make meaningful progress. And so, as daunting of a task as I think many of us find ourselves in this space, it's comforting, I think, to know that others either share those challenges or have addressed those challenges before. And I think that just looking for those partners is probably the first possible next step for anyone faced with a significant challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We're really, really happy to have you guys on. And I think there's so many nuggets of gold for people to take away. So we will include the links. I know you mentioned the size of the prize report with HSBC. We'll include that link in the, assuming it is public, right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Like, I hope I'm not promising something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll be sure to include that link in the in the resources for this episode. And do follow Apparel Impact Institute if you're interested in this. You can sign up for their newsletter on the website. Very, very interesting work happening in this space. Thank you so much, Kurt.
Thank you, Kaitlyn.